This will be the last of our introductory videos, and in this I will simply mention a few of the themes of First Peter and a little bit about the significance, I think, of the book. It's a rich work, and there are many themes I think we could draw out of it, but I'm going to mention just three, I think, for our purposes. The first being that Peter sees Jesus as the Christian's foundational principle and identity. Now, this is a little bit different from what we'll experience in Peter is different from what we experienced in our past study of James. While James is clearly trying to show that he is following Jesus in his teaching, that he has learned from Jesus' teaching, is passing that on to us, he only two times explicitly names Jesus. And we only find the name Jesus Christ two times in the book. Not so with Peter. Peter is going to talk about Jesus a lot. And it's important for Peter that the hearer knows that if you're going to be a part of this faith, this new thing that is spreading throughout the world in Peter's day, that you will be wholly identified by Jesus Christ. Peter has no category for the casual Christian, the cultural Christian. It doesn't exist, at least in this letter. It's not there. You are wholly identified with Jesus, and you're willing to accept the consequences that come from that identity. And one of the consequences is one of the second major themes I'm going to talk about, that of suffering. If you take up the name of Christ, Peter tells his hearers in Asia Minor, if you take up the name of Christ, you're going to suffer for that name. You will not be treated well. You will be hated. And you're not to think that's strange. It shouldn't be unusual. You shouldn't be taken aback by the fact that you are suffering. You can expect it. It's important for Peter that we hear that and that we know that. There is sometimes we tend to think that when we think about the cross and Jesus on the cross, we say, well, he took our sin, he took our death upon himself, and we sort of link that with our suffering. He suffered. He died for us on the cross. He suffered for us on the cross. That must mean that we don't have to die as Jesus took that death, and we don't have to suffer. What is true, he took our sin, and ultimately he took our death and gives us life so that we can live the life that God would have us to live. But it does not mean he took our suffering. He suffered for us, and then tells us we will join him in that suffering as long as we are here on earth. So we cannot expect, Peter says, we cannot expect to lose that, to miss that. Know that you will suffer for the name. I will add to this something that I got in one of the commentaries talking about Christian suffering, that sometimes this suffering is that of being actively persecuted, but the suffering of the Christian goes more than that. There's also a suffering of self-denial. And I'll read from Job's commentary once again, where she writes that sin is often thought of as being motivated by the temptation for pleasure, but perhaps the real power of sin lies in the avoidance of pain and suffering. It is better to suffer unfulfilled needs and desires than to sin. And this is spoken to Christians, even who are not in, say, the experience of those in Asia Minor, to where Christianity is a new thing, an unheard of thing, a dangerous thing, and therefore is actively persecuted. Even those not in that experience must expect to suffer. And sometimes that will be simply the suffering of self-denial, of saying no to ourselves. I can't do that because I am Christ's, and he is mine, and he is in me, and I cannot act that way because I'm a Christian. I'll say that again. It is better to suffer unfulfilled needs and desires than to sin. That is something we all need to hear. So suffering is a part of the Christian life. Third theme is the relationship between Christians and culture. And this is also tied into suffering and to Jesus being our identity. Once again, Peter's writing to a place, to people who are in a minority culture. Right? They're Christians in a culture that is not Christian. And they experience that as being foreigners. So one of the main themes in the book, I think, is that of being a foreigner, being an exile, in the diaspora, right? The sojourner. This is something that Peter's writing, calling his hearers. And it may well be that this is both a literal thing, sort of a physical thing, and a spiritual, metaphorical sort of thing. It may well be literal in the fact that, once again, as we mentioned in a previous video, these may be people who have been exiled from Rome, who've had to leave Rome or have gone willingly to participate in colonies. They may be away from home. They may be foreigners in many different ways. But I think more importantly, Peter is saying that as a Christian, you're not at home in this world. You're not to receive the culture that you live in as being that which identifies you. You are to be a foreigner in it. You are to, your kingdom is not of this world. It is not, this is not your home. You're waiting for a greater home. You're a foreigner, you hear, and you should accept that role. And the difficulties that it brings. Once again, that will bring suffering and difficulties. I have lived much of my life as a foreigner in a strange land. And there are inherent difficulties to that, that are natural and are unavoidable. Anyone who's a minority in a different culture will find that there are just difficulties in living in that culture. That's just simply the way it is. And Christians will, and in some ways should, fill that role, in the sense that the secular culture around us, we should not expect it to sort of make accommodations for us naturally, or to always welcome us with open arms. We're going to be foreigners there, and sort of on the outside. Now, this is what Peter expects from his people. Now, this is a little bit strange. I'm going to talk a little bit about the significance of the book. This is a little bit strange for much of us in the Western world, which has much of its history soaked in Christianity, in which Christian thought has not necessarily been the minority. It's been an accepted, normal thing. It's maybe becoming less so, but this is much of our history and our heritage in the West. While for much of the world, this is just the non-Western world, this is just the normal way of life. First Peter is really, in the West, is sort of unduly ignored to some degree. I mean, it's not that we never talk about it and we set it aside as less canonical or something like that. But we tend to think of, say, the book of Romans as containing all that you need to know, right? That's where you go for we revere the book of Romans. It's a wonderful book. We should revere it. First Peter is similar in that it contains everything. Luther says that First Peter contains everything a Christian needs to know. You can go to First Peter, you can read it, you'll know everything a Christian needs to know. It is a condensed version telling of the faith, and it gives us in short form a telling of who Christ is, what He has done, what that means for us. It gives us what our future is and how we live now. Everything we need to know about receiving the Christian faith, living the Christian faith, where we're going, we can find it in First Peter. And then it's just a rich, masterful work. But it also includes a lot about the suffering of it. And because in the West, I think, we have not felt that suffering that acutely, we don't relate as well to First Peter. Whereas in much of the world where Christians have been all of their life in the minority, First Peter is the book. First Peter is something that they've clung to and received hope for. It is of great prominence to them in the sense that it's what gets them through their day in many cases. So, in the West, increasingly, Christians are finding themselves recognizing probably the truth that we have, and maybe always true devoted people of Christ have always been somewhat in the minority in culture, but now more sort of pointedly so. There is a trend in the West against Christianity, and while I'm not apocalyptic by nature, I don't necessarily see a reason to think that trend is going to be reversed anytime soon. So we will increasingly, I think, find ourselves in the situation of those to whom Peter is writing about suffering, being foreigners, feeling that more acutely. So I think it will be very good for us to really dive into First Peter and to soak ourselves in it and to receive what Peter has to say. Pastorally, he's trying to help Christians navigate the pain and suffering that accompanies following Christ, especially in places where Christians are in the minority. And so I think that there's no reason why we shouldn't assume that applies to us, and that we shouldn't learn from it. So I'm looking forward to this and learning from it. I encourage you, those of you who will be following along, to do follow along well, think, study along. I'm glad that I think our women are going to be studying it along with us. Love to hear some of the things you're learning. There's no way I can both get myself and then pass on to you all the riches of this book. And so I would love to benefit from your study and your thinking and learn from you guys as well. So I hope we're able to do this collaboratively. Please pray as well for me. I'll pray for you as we study this. May God grant us the light of His Holy Spirit as we approach His Word. May we be blessed and encouraged and edified, strengthened to live this life, live out the identity that we have been given. So please pray for me. I'll be praying for you. And I'm looking forward to our time together in 1 Peter.